Donald Trump hit a slam dunk yet again in Ohio. Former United States president and current 2024 GOP likely candidate won 79.2% of the vote in the Ohio presidential primary on Tuesday. Former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, current Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who, of course, no longer actually in the race, they got 14.4% and 3.4% respectively.
As for the Democratic primary in the Buckeye State, President Joe Biden won 87.1% of the vote, and former Democratic candidate Dean Phillips, who dropped out of the race on March 6th, won 12.9%. Also on the line in November is Ohio's Senate seat. Trump-backed Republican Senate candidate Bernie Moreno won the Senate GOP primary in the state last night, which means he will face Democrat Sherrod Brown. This will determine which party controls the upper chamber in the state. Now, joining us to discuss is congressional reporter at The Hill, Julia Manchester. Thanks for joining us today, Julia.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so Ohio looms large for the long-term fate of the Democratic versus Republican Party in the Senate. And I wonder what you make of the turnout for the respective candidates, Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and whether you read anything into that. About twice as many people came out to vote in the Republican primary as in the Democratic Party primary. Do you read anything into that, or does that have to do with other things that were happening on the ticket?
Look, I think it's always hard to tell with primaries because they're technically off election days. And on top of that, you basically, for all intents and purposes, have two incumbents running, one official incumbent, one unofficial incumbent. But I think the turnout for Donald Trump and the, firing up of the GOP base is obviously very important for him. He wants to be able to have that strength going into November. But for Joe Biden, I think that's certainly a bit of a red flag. It's early. A lot can be done to course correct between now and November, but especially when you have factors, not necessarily in this election, but in past primaries with the uncommitted vote, for example, a progressive base, which is rather unhappy with the president. That's where I start to see some, concerning signs for the president. That being said, I haven't really delved into the exit polling and the crosstabs yet, but I think the Biden campaign should be paying attention to this.
Let's talk about Bernie Moreno, the now Republican candidate for Senate in the state, backed by Trump, strongly supported by J.D. Vance, who was campaigning for him. You told me that several other Republicans in the race, they had gotten more support from, I think, kind of the establishment in the state, other than J.D. Vance, up against Sherrod Brown, who's one of the last, Democrats standing in a state that has become redder and redder over time. Obviously, this could come down to control of the Senate. Who wins this race? What are we looking at? Yeah,
look, it really could go either way at this point, and it's still very early in the general election, obviously. But Sherrod Brown is a bit of a unicorn in Ohio. He's the last statewide elected Democrat. He raises a lot of money. He oftentimes, back when President Obama was running for president, as well as Joe Biden, he normally runs ahead of the Democrat at the top of the ticket. So he is a force in that state. And I think one of the things Sherrod Brown has been able to do very well is appeal to the working class, blue collar vote in Ohio that Trump and a lot of Republicans have been able to tap into. So this will be a major test. What's difficult for Brown is that in past elections in Ohio, recent elections, we've seen that Trump's endorsed candidate normally does well. Ohio is a very Trumpian state when it comes to the Republican base. So it could go either way. We could expect this to be one of the more expensive races in the country, though, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's what's so interesting about the Democratic Party's choice to do some of this Pied Pipering with Bernie Moreno, believing that he would be a better candidate for Sherrod Brown to run against, spending some money lifting him up in that race. I do wonder about the substance of him and his politics. I did see that there was some back and forth about some of his opponents in this race being too LGBT friendly for having stood in front of the LGBTQ flag at one point. And I'm asking about these kind of cultural questions because although Ohio has been going redder, it is also true that Ohioans came out big time to vote for abortion protections just last year. So do you expect that to play a significant role? in the success of either Joe Biden in a general election context or in this Senate race, once abortion is more clearly foregrounded as an issue that people should be keeping their eye on.
Look, I think you can expect Sherrod Brown to be talking quite a bit about abortion. And with someone like Bernie Moreno, it's easier for him to talk about that issue versus someone like a Matt Dolan for maybe who is more moderate, comes from a more moderate part of the state out just outside of Cleveland. So I think it's easier for Sherrod Brown to really pin that on Bernie Moreno and say, look, he's been endorsed by the guy who made the Supreme Court tilt right, which led to the overturning of Roe versus Wade. So we're going to see a lot of abortion messaging on that. But at the same time, though, I think Sherrod Brown needs to be very careful on that messaging, to obviously message on that point, but also talk about economics. You know, it's interesting, way before Trump was even on the political scene talking about China and such, Sherrod Brown was essentially doing that. Tim Ryan, same thing. So Democrats in Ohio have really had figured out that formula. Sherrod Brown's the last statewide one standing, but I think that's because he's been able to message so tactfully on all these issues.
We haven't talked to you in a couple weeks, I think, here on Rising. You know, what do you make of the state of the race right now between inevitably Donald Trump and Joe Biden? We've been talking a lot about polls showing Biden's massive unfavorability numbers seem to keep getting worse. The difficulties having with young voters, minority voters, even black voters, a reliable basis traditionally for the Democratic Party. Is it becoming too late to turn things around?
I don't think it's necessarily too late. I think the big question is, will these voters unhappy with President Biden right now, particularly progressive voters, will they, when presented with the choice, and it's very concrete, whether that's after the election or, in a few weeks, maybe or right now when it's very clear who it's going to be, will they say, I'd rather stay home and potentially end up, inadvertently boost Donald Trump or just go vote for Joe Biden? We don't really know what they're going to do yet. There's obviously, everyone has their own way of doing that. But I think for Joe Biden and Donald Trump, it's going to get closer. It always gets closer. It's going to get neck and neck at some point. So I think, there's so many different factors at play. But unlike past elections, I will say, and this is obviously a problem for Biden, the progressive race, whatever's happening in the Israel-Hamas war is going to impact Joe Biden, and his handling of that. His handling of that war is going to impact Joe Biden with his own base. So that's something we're seeing that we don't see in a lot of other elections.
Yeah, I'm looking at this again with fresh eyes, thinking about uncommitted. There wasn't an uncommitted ballot line in this Ohio race, so we can't get that as a kind of harbinger of how much discontent there is about Gaza in Ohio. But I am noticing that Dean Phillips's numbers do seem to be particularly high, especially since he's not even in the race anymore. I feel like 12.9% are some of the best numbers that he's put up so far. 67,889 voters coming out to vote for him. Might it be the case that people are registering their discontent with Joe Biden in Ohio by, frankly, using the only option available to them on the ballot line and voting for Dean Phillips?
Absolutely. And I'm curious to see who those voters voted for, in the Senate primary, or if they were voting, in the Senate primary on the Republican side, if they had jumped over that kind of a thing. So we'll have to see. But that is a very good point, particularly in a state like Ohio. How that impacts Sherrod Brown, we'll have to see, because we know that Sherrod Brown tends to run ahead of the Democrat at the top of the ticket, but who knows?
Yeah, well, that will be one race to follow for sure in the upcoming election. We'll have more Rising right after this. Thanks so much for being here today, Julia.
Thanks, guys.